Hello.
Hey, Juliana, how are you?
Thank you so much for coming on. I am very well, and part of it is thanks to you, I have to say.
That's very kind of you. Well, I'm a fan as well. I love what you all are doing, and how wonderful to have real journalism and all this grassroots support. It's just what we need these days.
It's amazing that I'm real journalism coming to you from my basement. I mean, we used to have a studio, whatever. There's a whole long thing. But anyway, just before we get into the interview, I want to thank you personally for your book, Misconceptions. It literally saved my life. Aww. And I encourage any mother who went through a traumatic birth to read it. And anyone who is considering having a child, read it first, preemptively, I would suggest. So you are filled with knowledge. But thank you for that.
I'm glad it was useful. How do you have a bigger small person in your life right now? Or
I have a 4.5-year-old daughter, and I love her so much. But I faced all the things you discussed in that book, all of the other than being a Black woman giving birth, the increased medical interventions, feeling powerless. And I knew a lot of that stuff before going in, but just knowing about it doesn't necessarily cure you of, and keep you from having to deal with it. If that's
true. Yeah. Very true. I had the same experience. I knew all about it. And yet, 2 C-sections, massive, institution pressuring the experience of childbirth in America in a certain direction. So anyway, thank goodness that your little being is safe and well, and you are, and I'm glad that I was helpful.
Yes, very helpful. And one of the major things that was helpful to me was just, we're totally off on another subject, but you put so clearly in the book how the medical community, the birth medical community, makes women feel like their bodies are failing them because they're not progressing fast enough, XYZ. But in your book, you wrote that mammals, which we are mammals, if they sense danger during birth giving, they tend to shut the process down. And so it really switched my thought from, oh, my body didn't do the thing it was supposed to do, to actually my body did exactly what it was supposed to do to protect that child. And it just didn't fit in with our current medicalized culture of birth here in the United States. So thank you very much for that. It was very liberating.
I'm glad.
Well, on to the book that we're doing now, you've done now. We're living in this incredibly dangerous moment, as you write about, as we edge toward a totalitarian turning point. We're starting to see marginalized people and groups targeted, silenced, often jailed. We live in a time when information counter to the official narrative is censored and erased from the public sphere, when books and articles and even scientific literature are banned, labeled as fake news or dangerous misinformation. In your new book, Outrages, Sex Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love, you show what happens when a society, in this case, Victorian England, becomes obsessed with contagion and impurity and criminalizes what it calls immoral acts and dangerous ideas, where the state feels emboldened to invade and monitor people's private lives, including what they read, what they write, and whom they are associated with and dare to love. Naomi Wolf, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Juliana.
Can you talk about what moved you to write this particular book at this particular time?
Sure. So you're highlighting exactly the right headlines in Outrages, because while the book is about people who lived over a century ago in another country, it's also about issues that are, pressing in on us, as you say, so powerfully today. And I think of Outrages as a prequel in a way to The End of America, which a lot of your readers may be familiar with, in which in 2008 I predicted, sadly, I wish I'd been wrong, all of the rush to totalitarianism that we're experiencing today. So Outrages is about an amazing man, a hero of the LGBTQ rights movement, John Addington Symonds, who wrote the first gay rights manifesto in English. And I was drawn to him. I was told about him by my advisor because I went back to graduate school in midlife, and my advisor's a special.
Good for you. I love you.
It was very, very satisfying to be Dr. Wolf at last. But but he told me, Dr. Stefano Evangelista told me about Simmons, and he handed me 2 out of 3 gigantic green tomes of Simmons' letters. And by the time I was a few pages in, I was hooked, because at that time I was the mother of a teenage boy. And this was Simmons as a teenage boy in Victorian England, knowing he was what we would call gay, right? Knowing he was attracted to other young men, other youths, and realizing that his future was impossible as someone who loved men. So my heart really went out to him right away. And then the more I learned about him, the more extraordinary and important his life became to me, as someone who's fought against repression and restriction of liberties my whole career, because he came of age in a Britain that was innovating the tools that we see around us today. In other words, Britain was a secular modern state. It couldn't use the excuse of the church to say, we're going to get in between the covers of your bed, or we're going to censor your speech. So you see in real time, as Simmons grows up and tries to become a poet and a critic who writes about what we would call homosexuality and homosexual love. The word wasn't really invented till he was older. You see the state developing new ways to constrain speech and invade privacy. So this ranged from the 1857 Obscene Publications Act, which really was the first kind of Western piece of legislation to massively criminalize what you read, what you publish, what you can print, and its metaphor is so current today, because they formulated the idea that words, speech could be contagious, right? You mentioned this in your intro, that the state had an interest in policing the commons of how we speak to each other, how we produce text, how we read, what we read, in the interest of kind of a moral public health. And that was such an effective tool at a time when many new classes of people were clamoring for more rights, everything from women, lobbying for the vote and for property rights and custody rights, to working people who wanted to be able to cast votes and affect social outcomes. And so at a time of great, pushes for more equality, the elites kind of innovated tools like censorship that directly impacted Simmons and the circle of artists and critics and bohemians around him. And also there were new innovations in criminalizing same-sex relationships and creating moral panic around same-sex relationships. And so that also, staked out this tool that this modern state uses all the time of, we are allowed to police your body. And you see it now with abortion law and restrictions, or you see it with, battles over vaccination, or you see it with, the kind of legislation we're seeing today, in which the state arrogates to itself the right to police the body, to invade the body, to monitor the body. And this, Outrages is kind of tells the story of how the modern state kind of innovated its assertion to these rights. And you see playing out in this love relationship between Simmons and the poet Walt Whitman, like an epistolary love relationship, because they never met in person. And in the relationships around him, how these laws broke people and restricted free speech and human love and sexuality in Victorian England. And then it crossed over to the US, of course.
Oh, yes. So, and here we are today. Your book that you mentioned earlier, The End of America, you predicted, as you said, the rise of paramilitary groups, secret prisons, arbitrary detention and releasing of ordinary citizens, surveillance of ordinary citizens, and a whole bunch of other benchmarks that we have actually, unfortunately, crossed. We've got them now. I'm sure it gives you no pleasure to see you were right in your predictions. What message might you have for those activists watching today who are working diligently to stop these forces of tyranny we see around us? Is there a message of hope from Addington Simmons' life?
I mean, definitely. And it's a beautiful question. It's a necessary one. John Addington Simmons never gave up believing that someday there would be readers and a society that valued what he saw as the nobility and beauty of love between men and sex between men. And so even though he had to write in code, even though he had to change the pronouns of the love poems that he published, even though he left, I mean, it's partly a detective story, which just will give you chills. He left toward the end of his life a kind of secret code embedded in different poems that when you put them together, they tell the story of his great love affair at the end of his life with the love of his life, Angelo Fusato, a gondolier. Even though he had to do all these things to avoid—
I'm in love with every gondolier I've ever met. I could see how that could easily happen. They're a very attractive group. Sorry, go ahead.
Like, yes, he was a very charismatic fellow. But anyway, even though Simmons lived his whole life abutting against the restrictions and the criminalization of both the physical acts and the speech that he wanted to use to express his love, he believed so strongly in the future that he wrote the first Gay Rights Manifesto in English, A Problem in Modern Ethics, at the end of his life. And he never lived to see the day. He died quite young, in his early 50s. But that trickled forward in bits and pieces, in secret reading groups. People passed it from hand to hand. It was picked up in a book called Sexual Inversion, which became a bestseller, after Simmons was dead. And then that, changed our model of what human sexual variation is. So now we assume that, human sexual variation is on a natural spectrum, and no way of being is better or more natural or more immoral than any other way of being. Sexual Inversion was the first book to really make that a mainstream idea. So the takeaway is that even after Simmons was gone from this planet, his faith in telling his truth bore fruit, in the future. And, and then landmark rulings, homosexuality was decriminalized in Britain in the 60s, in our country in the 60s as well. And even though it's a constant fight, like there's new legislation targeting trans people, there's new legislation targeting the Human Rights Act in Britain, right? It's a constant fight to protect these rights to love freely. Simmons never gave up hope, and as a result, we do have a much more equal world than he would ever live to see. But the other takeaway, and I really can't say this enough, is that the dangers are bipartisan, right? It's not like, oh, if we get Democrats in the White House, all this tyranny will go away. No, no, no. I'm appalled to see that it's the left now, and I say this as a member of the left, that is starting to occupy the traditional place of the censor, which has traditionally been from the right and more conservative forces.
I just spent the morning being like, we were academically discussing this topic. Someone took offense to something that was said, and now there's a whole meeting going on about why it has to be, what are we going to do? Someone's taken offense. Meanwhile, as a former psychotherapist, when someone takes offense, that's their offense. When someone is triggered, it's actually kind of good for them, because if you actually want to overcome the thing that you are triggered by, you need to meet it over and over again. So
I've got to jump in there. Thank you so much. I just need to speak to that for a minute. I'm a survivor of sexual assault in childhood, which I've started to write about and speak about. And I know perfectly well, deeply, what it means to be triggered. And when, having worked hard with my therapist on PTSD, the best thing is not to silence triggers. The best thing is to get all the support you need to wade in there and face them and engage with them and stare them down. We do not want, as survivors, to live in a world that is safe. There is no such thing. And moving on, having said that, moving on to what you were saying about, creating a space free of offense, right? Like, this was exactly the language that the censors in John Addington Simmons' day, which then became picked up by the Comstock Acts in the United States in 1873, right? Exactly the language they were using. We don't want to raise a blush on the cheek of the virgin who's reading this illicit poetry, or
why would the virgin be reading this poetry? No,
exactly. But we don't want to offend people. We don't want to cause, distaste or dismay with ideas that today, what were they censoring? They were censoring same-sex love discourse. They were censoring information about contraception, right? They were censoring advertisements for diaphragms. They were, like one of my heroines in Outrages, Annie Besant, lost custody of her 8-year-old daughter, Mabel, because she dared to publish a pamphlet telling working class women how to control their reproductive lives so that they weren't, every year giving birth to children who didn't have enough to eat, who were rickety, who were ill. That's what was considered obscene publication, right? A medical treatise about contraception. So the minute you let the censor in the door, it's over, right? No matter how noble your stated intentions, if Outrages proves one thing, it is that censorship cures nothing. Right? Censoring gay people didn't get rid of gay people. Censoring discourse about trans people isn't getting rid of trans people. Censoring discourse about contraception didn't get rid of contraception. What censorship does every time, and I love this powerful graphic, is they start with the marginalized, they come to us. And for journalists to be calling for censorship, like I was horrified to hear the New York Times did, for journalists to say, the espionage acts are a good idea, or maybe the First Amendment went too far. That is the beginning of the end. And Outrages shows exactly what happens. These laws don't stop with getting rid of the most hateful speech, even though I think the most hateful speech is useful to hear. These laws always go to the heart of civil society. They always end up with journalists, editors, opposition leaders, outspoken clerics being the ones hauled off to prison. And what they suppress is freedom.
It's interesting. I had a dream last night that I was hauled off to prison for talking.
Wow.
I know, just this morning. Maybe it was because I was reading the book and I was, paying attention to it. But yeah, it's a little scary to just think you're doing a show, you're trying to be a public service, you're, reaching a lot of people, and then you're actually risking your life for hopefully for truth and the kind of ideas that are somehow dangerous. Getting back to this idea, when I went to Australia, they had a thing called the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. And I thought, oh my God, we need to have that in New York. Let's do it. Yeah. So maybe you'll get an invitation someday. Who knows? If I have it, you'll be the first one on the invite list. These forces at play here have an entire right-wing talking machine. And we also saw President Trump in the first debate basically talk over the entirety of Joe Biden wasn't, not that, again, Joe Biden is any kind of savior that we can rely on, but he wasn't even allowed to make a point or speak a sentence. I felt this idea of I don't know, just your thoughts about where we're living in this moment now, where there is these constant news talking machines that have ideas that forward ideas that are not egalitarian, to say the least. And then having our public officials act that way, as if hearing about Social Security is going to undermine their entire platform. What your thoughts about what we're seeing today?
I mean, what we're seeing is a very degraded space that used to be called journalism, right? And the story of how we got there is pretty well known. I mean, with the rise of the internet and the decline of paid subscribed for journalism couldn't sustain itself. And so now, unfortunately, public space where we all debate is mediated by Twitter and Facebook. And, you were talking about how, or the Times today was talking about how those are now kind of in the crosshairs for not being accurate. But that's kind of our fault for letting Twitter and Facebook be the place that we conduct important discussions that have to be truth-based. So one of the things I encourage people to do is go back to analog media and support platforms like yours, support real paid journalism, pay for news, because really with news you get what you pay for. And we need to, support independent publishing. We need to support independent bookstores. All independent ideas that are verifiable are under attack right now. It's not just, as I keep saying, it's not just from the right. I actually experienced this. The attack.
I was just going to ask you that. Go ahead.
Very fascinating. The attack on the book last spring, because as many of your readers may know, I made 2 mistakes in interpreting 2 cases. But there was this massive attack on the book that led to its cancellation last year. Thank goodness my wonderful publisher, Chelsea Green, another publisher, brought it out. You know, they had published The End of America, and they are fearless. But the attacks, which were global, repeated an erasure of LGBTQ history, which is not true. They claimed that dozens of men were not executed in the 19th century, and they were, sadly, for sodomy. They said other homophobic things that are not true. They said that the men executed were all rapists and child molesters, which is not true. The offense of sodomy included same-sex consenting sex, and people died for that. You know, consenting adults died for that in the 19th century in Britain. So not only was that history really important, not just queer history, but everyone's history of state atrocities wiped out. But interestingly to me, we did an analysis of this vast bot and troll attack, and it had launched from Breitbart. And it was activated. There's a tool out of the University of Indiana that analyzes digital attacks. And the troll networks were right-wing, white supremacist, Trump-based networks. So it was like this political attack, but also, you know, the left also reproduced inaccurate statements wiping out queer history in this period. So and other influencers are facing this, by the way. I'm in touch with a well-known climate scientist who, you know, faced a similar kind of digital attack. People are starting to write about these kind of Cambridge Analytica type, I don't know if that was who did it, but, you know, these vast digital attacks. And what I see is that independent commentators are kind of being taken off the chessboard. And when you want to mediate public opinion, it's really convenient to get rid of independent publishers, get rid of independent news outlets, get rid of you know, valid commentators who are fact-based, and that way you can just tell your algorithm, you know, what to persuade people to believe, with no mediation at all by truth or fact-checking or counter-interrogation or all the things that journalism and public debate used to do and used to provide. So that's what I'm seeing, and it's quite terrifying, but there are ways to fight back against it. And one of them is really to understand, let me just add this tiny riff. We're talking about censorship. What people really have to understand, and I'm glad that, you know, the Senate is looking at it, though I don't want them to be the censors of the censors, is that censorship now can take place without fingerprints, purely digitally. And what I mean is, you know, when Google serves up a bunch of false stories, right, but the true stories are behind a paywall, you don't know what you're not seeing. And even with digitized academic articles now, ProQuest, all these archives are being bought up by for-profit companies, but they're still called the National Archives, or they're still called, you know, the British Library Newspaper Database or whatever, but they're third-party for-profit companies with their obligations not to truth or to accuracy or to history, but to their shareholders. So they can, and I run a digital data site, you can tweak the back end of what you serve up to someone searching for a subject any way you want without even lying, right? It's just how you tag it, how it comes up. So that's a new form of censorship. You don't know what you're not seeing. So in addition to supporting real newspapers, independent outlets like yours, I really want people to start thinking about, you know, paper libraries and paper books again, and public spaces where history cannot, and public opinion cannot be so censored and mediated via technology.
We are speaking with Naomi Wolf, author of many books, but the most recent, Outrages, Sex, Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love, is out now. Go get yourself a copy. Naomi, what are your hopes for the book? What do you want it to accomplish?
Well, Julianna, that's a beautiful question, especially given the journey this book has had. You know, the most important thing, because it's such a beautiful and important story in my view, and I just feel honored to be one of the people to bring John Addington's story to a larger public. The most important thing is for it just to get into the hands of readers, right? I mean, this book was literally pulled. Libraries got a letter asking them to destroy it not to send it back, not to take it off the shelves, to destroy it last spring.
Couldn't they just put a little thing in it, like a sticker that said, oops, you know, they could have.
An errata slip is how you deal with a couple of mistakes. You put an errata slip in and you know, update it in the next printing. But this book was, no one in North America could get it till now, right? It was unavailable. So I'm very proud and pleased to say that it's on a number of category bestseller lists already, including British law and European law and LGBTQ studies. So it's evaded its fate of having been killed off as a book, which is very appropriate given that it's about censorship. So the other thing that's quite beautiful is that the LGBTQ press is, you know, all I wanted was for Simmons to find his readers and his community and his fans. And I don't think his fans are restricted to the LGBTQ community, because his courage and his faith in love and his moving commitment to tell the truth, no matter what obstacles were placed in his path or how much real danger he faced. He could have gone to prison at hard labor for telling the truth about love in his lifetime. I wanted that to get to the hands of readers of all kinds, all backgrounds, and it is. So that, you know, obviously I just hope for more of that, because that's the mission I had in writing this book. However, you know, as we said earlier, this isn't just a book about, you know, a heroic, if, you know, nervous and conflict laden gay man from 130 years ago. This is also a book about now, this present moment, and how we got here, right? I keep saying it's a prequel to the end of America. Where do these assumptions come from that we are dealing with so much in lockdown around the world? Like, this is a real medical crisis, but it's also being used as an excuse for a global power grab by authoritarian forces. And so we need to protect our civil rights, you know, at a time when we're being told, I mean, people in Britain and in Europe are not even being allowed to have visitors in their homes, right? So there are a lot of, sorry?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's shocking. It's shocking. There's a lot of autonomy and private life that people are losing without really understanding how the state got in the role of saying you can't have visitors, or you can't have more than 5 people in your home, you know, at one time.
It's very convenient not to let people gather at a time when autocrats are working to take over and really nail down their authority.
I'm really glad you said that, Julianna, because again, you don't have, you know, you can be a card-carrying Democrat as I am, progressive as I am, you know, believe in science, believe in medicine, and also former political consultant. There is nothing that people who want a power grab like more than a crisis, right? Because you can, every kind of agenda can get in there. So we are seeing crackdowns on liberties around the world. And this crisis is being used as the excuse. And at a time like this, and we are seeing, you know, we were saying earlier, these horrific calls for censorship at home in North America, in Canada, right? Bills to, their state bills making it illegal. You can't give a contract to someone who has ever criticized Israel in some of these Koch-funded state bills, right? So they're trying to get around the First Amendment. And you know, college campuses in America, trying to deplatform people, trying to say, don't give that person a hearing. You know, that's dangerous speech. I mean, I remember being a fellow at Barnard just a few years ago, and a Palestinian American student came to me and said, you know, all they did was put up a banner that showed factually pre-1948 Palestine. That's all it showed. And the president took it down because it was making students uncomfortable. So these are perilous things to do in the United States of America. If you don't have debate, you can't have freedom. If you don't have access to many, many interpretations of history, you cannot have history, right? You can't have accuracy. If journalists are not free to make people uncomfortable, you can't have journalism. If you don't have journalism, you can't have liberty, right? These things are all connected. So, you know, Outrages is really a warning shot, because it's like a case study showing, well, here was a free society, you know, with these great traditions in Britain of privacy and free speech. I mean, free, you know, obviously for that period, not for ours, but freer than Europe, freer than, you know, countries around the world. And within the course of just a few decades, these laws made people terrified to put pen to paper, terrified when they got into bed with a loved one. And that can happen anywhere. And it crushed freedom in ways we still inherit. Like, the biggest thing I want people to take away from reading Outrages is when the state says, well, we have the power to do this or to do that, or we have the power to determine if you're a man or a woman, or we have the power to say, what goes into your body or what doesn't go into your body, or what, how you deal with your uterus, what kind of, what kind of contraception you can have, right? What comes out of your mouth, what can be published. I want everyone to say, who says you have that power? That power was invented. Absolutely.
Naomi Wolf, author of Outrages, Sex, Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love, just her most recent book. But before that, Give Me Liberty, The End of America, and also the landmark bestseller, The Beauty Myth, Misconceptions, the one that totally saved me. You completed your doctorate in English language and literature from the University of Oxford in 2015. Congratulations. And thank you so much for joining me on the program. It was really just a joy to know that you were coming on this whole week.
Oh, Julianna, I'm so happy that we had this opportunity, and thank you for what you and your colleagues do as well.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you'll join us again. I really appreciate your voice.
Anytime. I'd love that. Thank you, Julianna.
Thank you. You're watching Act TV. I'm Julianna Forlano. Follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, wherever you find Act TV. You can follow me on Twitter, Julianna Forlano. That's where I post my political comments. Or if you just want to see what I'm doing in my off life, Facebook. So way to go. And I do post a few nature pictures on Instagram every so often. I feel like there's nothing I could say to follow up that interview. I hope it was of use to you. Thank you so much for watching. We will be back tomorrow with additional guests as per usual. Tomorrow are coming on our program. Oh, who's coming on tomorrow? I don't even know. It doesn't say here. Somewhere it should say. Oh, this gets very confusing. Anyway, tomorrow's guest is blank. So I know someone's coming. Join us and we'll all find out. Thanks for watching. See you then.